I mean, this is a long-winded way to say that at the end of the day, if you want a Palestinian, a two-state solution, which I still believe is the only way that we can end this conflict.
Is there hope for the Palestinians when this war comes to an end? I think we should say when it comes to an end, not if it comes to an end. Is there hope? And what is that hope? Now, yes, as an evangelical Christian, you know that I believe the hope is in Jesus Christ, and I'd love to see every Palestinian in Gaza and the West Bank come to faith in Jesus Christ. But there's also, we're not just talking about the spiritual future of the region. We're talking about the geopolitical, economic future. We're talking about freedom. We're talking about civil rights. We're talking about human rights. And what does the future, particularly of Gaza, look like? And what does current polling, credible polling by Palestinians of Palestinians, what is it telling us about what Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank want and what they see as their future? Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg, and this is the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Inside the Epicenter podcast is part of the educational mission of the Joshua Fund, a ministry that my wife and I started in 2006, 18 years ago this summer. And we did it to bless Israel and her Arab and Muslim neighbors in the name of Jesus. Yes, we want to strengthen the local church in Israel and the Arab world, but we also want to mobilize Christians in the region and from around the world to show compassion and assistance to those living in a very difficult neighborhood. And rarely has it been more difficult to be an Israeli or a Palestinian than right now. And my wife and I care about that very deeply, and our team does. And over the last 18 years, by God's mercies, we've raised and deployed more than $100 million to bless people in this very difficult and challenging place. So with that context for why we do what we do, I want to welcome my guest. Ghaith Al Omari is a Palestinian scholar and a policy expert. He himself is Palestinian. He served on the Palestinian negotiating team during the permanent status peace talks from 1999 to 2001. The whole point of that, from the Palestinian perspective, was to achieve a Palestinian state alongside of Israel, coming out of the Oslo Agreements 1 and 2 from the early 1990s, and building on the peace treaties between Israel and Egypt and Israel and the Kingdom of Jordan. That, of course, did not play out as Palestinians wanted, or even as some Israelis wanted. And now we are where we are today. Ghaith Al Omari is a former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Currently, and this is where I got to know him, he's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which, of course, as you might guess from the name, is based here in Washington, D.C., where I happen to be right now. His research focuses on Palestinian politics, on Jordanian politics, on peace diplomacy, and he's a regular in all kinds of media talking about these issues. He's also an advisory board member with All Arab News. And as you know, All Israel News and All Arab News are the platforms that my colleagues and I started back in 2020, now 4 years running almost, to try to provide better, credible, trustworthy coverage and analysis of what's happening in what we call the epicenter, Israel and the region. Basically, I'm the type of person who thinks I was going to either have an aneurysm being so angry at how the media covers Israel and the Arab Muslim world every single day. I was going to have a major blowout, or I was going to try to do it differently. And that's what we're trying to do. And although Ghaith and I don't always agree on everything, his perspective is so interesting. It's so refreshing. It's so important. And I learn a lot from him. And I value very much that he and people like him serve on our advisory board. So with that intro, Ghaith, welcome back. This is your second program on the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Thank you so much. Shukran, Habibi.
Thank you, Joel, both for your friendship first and foremost, but also for the amazing work that you do for Palestinians, for Israelis. And honestly, in today's polarized environment, the ability to have a conversation where we can disagree, yet not be disagreeable. And I think, and I thank you for that.
Well, you are welcome, and likewise. And I started this, and I'm not sure if I even finished that thought in the previous podcast. I'm finding it difficult right now in this hypersensitive, understandably so, geopolitical environment to have Palestinians who want to come on and talk to me about these issues. I'm open to listening to people who, I may have significant disagreements. I actually don't think I have huge disagreements with you. I'm skeptical about the future of a two-state solution. I haven't asked you about that in a while, so we'll talk about that. But I want to start with this idea, is there hope for the Palestinians? And specifically looking at what current polling is telling us by Palestinian pollsters, the most credible that there are. And let me just mention, Dr. Khalil Shikaki is the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. He and his team are based in Ramallah, which is effectively the working capital of the Palestinian Authority, though they would claim, of course, Jerusalem as their capital. But they're based out of Ramallah. And so his most recent poll was just in the last few weeks from when you and I are recording this. And it gives us some interesting data. So first, let me ask you a question before we get into specifics. How much trust should evangelical Christians or anyone outside of the region put on polling in a time of war?
Okay, this is difficult because I actually have tremendous respect for Dr. Shikaki, the pollster that you mentioned. Yet I think the nature of polling during the time of war is in itself difficult because emotions are high, etc., but also for practical reasons. And if you actually look at the fine print, I'm no pollster, but if you look at the fine print in these polls, he will say that the sample is not necessarily representative, etc. And I would add that there have been other polls from similarly credible Palestinian pollster that produce very, very different results. But for all of that said, I think it does give us at least a flavor of what the sentiment is right now among Palestinians.
Okay, so fair enough. And there was he doesn't even mention, let me be more clear. He does mention, for example, that it's very difficult to poll in northern Gaza right now because of the security situation. And so, yes, he's got a number of caveats. But again, we're trying to look at a snapshot of time and try to understand, it's not the specific numbers, it's that are there trajectories that are giving us some picture of where things are going. I wrote 2 columns for All Arab News based on this polling. I could have done 20 because there was so much there, but I want to give you the headlines for both. The first one was "No Regrets. 2 in 3 Palestinians support October 7th invasion and slaughter of Israelis by Hamas." And that's the subhead of that column was "Support for Hamas slaughter is even higher on the West Bank." So there were some interesting dichotomy between how Palestinians in Gaza saw October 7th and how Palestinians in the West Bank did. Difference between Gaza and West Bank. The other one, just put it up front, the headline was "New Poll Reveals Most Palestinians Don't Want Two-State Solution. Support for two states plunging, especially in Gaza." Let's start with how Palestinians see October 7th, because I think certainly for evangelicals, even those like myself who have compassion and are trying to look for a way forward with and for Palestinians, seeing that high number of Palestinians who support what happened on October 7th is very difficult to process, to accept, or to imagine a way forward. So let me just start there. How do you look at those numbers?
Okay, let me just start by saying I'm going to start by giving a context. I'm not trying to justify or sugarcoat anything, and I will come in the end towards kind of some of my deep criticism of what's happening there. Okay. But, some context here. I mean, one context is many Palestinians, actually most Palestinians, do not really know what happened on October 7th. Most Palestinians get their news, and this is, I think you see it in the same poll, from Al Jazeera and similar media that until today refuse to acknowledge that there was rape, killing of civilians, all of these things, even though Hamas themselves on October 7th were unfortunately live streaming the atrocities. So that's one part of it. And I would, argue, okay, this is a failure, almost criminal negligence. But that is kind of one factor to put there. Another factor to put there is the fact that in the middle of a war, it's very hard to have any empathy or sympathy beyond your own side. at the time of trauma, and I believe that both Palestinians and Israelis today as societies are traumatized, you become very self-absorbed. Thirdly, frankly, today, if you're a Palestinian, and you look at kind of who represents you, a corrupt, inefficient, useless leadership in Ramallah, or Hamas, Hamas at least took the initiative. Ugly, disgusting, whatnot. So this is the context. But to be honest, one of the core problems that we have right now is I do not see a moral leadership on the Palestinian side and largely on the Arab side that came out with any moral clarity and spoke about October 7th. The closest we got to that, the only country, let me take a step back, the only Arab country that condemned Hamas by name was Bahrain. That's it.
The Crown Prince.
The Crown Prince.
Yeah.
If you look at religious authorities, Al-Azhar in Egypt actually not only endorsed, but even called on Hamas to do more. The only voice that only two major Muslim voices that came out against, one was in Saudi Arabia, again, someone that Sheikh Mohammed Al-Isa, who did not go so far as to condemn Hamas, but basically made a general statement, and an Israeli Arab Islamist, Dr. Mansour Abbas, who actually was very, very clear about this. So there isn't the kind of moral leadership that came out and took a very clear position on this. And I think many of us have to not only look at what's going wrong with Palestinian politics, and I'm sure we're going to dig deeper into that, but actually what's going on in the region, both for the lack of clarity, but also for the fact that if there's one ray of hope, it was coming not from the traditional Arab world, Egypt and the Levant, but actually from a place that many considered until recently to be the hotbed of extremism, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, which is now leading the way in terms of at least having a more human discourse.
Yeah. Well, that's a sobering assessment, because you're right. The Bahraini Crown Prince was very clear, both in Arabic and in English, and in condemning what Hamas did. And it is striking that there haven't been more voices. And you mentioned one of them, which I guess I need to bring onto this podcast or onto my Rosenberg Report TV show, Sheikh Mohammed Al-Isa, because he is one of our board members, and I would say he is probably one of the great voices of moral clarity. But why? What is happening? I mean, let me ask you that. I'm not asking you to speak specifically about him, but why is this a difficult thing to condemn, even if you're overall saying we've got to get to a solution that gives Palestinians dignity and protects their human rights and their civil rights and finds a better way? Why is it hard to condemn the slaughter of babies and the rape of women and the slaughter of innocents, as opposed to a military on military conflict, which is always terrible, but is part of life?
I mean, unfortunately, what we saw in the Arab world, really maybe since the 1950s, is, first of all, an infiltration by the Muslim Brotherhood into the educational system. When I say an infiltration, I mean often by invitation.
Yeah, the Saudis invited them right in.
Exactly. And the Kuwaitis and the Jordanians, for example, struck a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood where they stay away from foreign policy and security, and they can deal with education and charity. What this created is a public sentiment, a public opinion that frankly has been brought up on a very anti-Israel, very anti-Western sentiment, but also a sense of victimhood and grievance. And when you see yourself as a victim, often you feel that everything is justified. What is interesting, and again, you said you look for hope. I always, myself, look for opportunity, at least, if not hope. I see this is changing. In the Gulf, you have young leaderships, whether it's in the United Arab Emirates, the Trailblazers, whether now in Saudi Arabia, for all of the kind of criticism one can rightly have on these governments. These are leaderships that want to create a national identity that is not based on grievance, not based on victimhood, but based on forward-looking, based on a sense of agency, a sense of possibility. I think that's why in a place like Egypt, for example, it's very hard for whether politicians or religious authorities to go against the public sentiment. In a place like Saudi Arabia, it's actually, from their perspective, this is an important message that they want to hammer in among their public, that there are certain things that are unacceptable. I would add to this specifically on Saudi Arabia. They themselves, have been stung by the radicalization that some of their own clerics have created. After 9/11, much of the terror that we saw was not only directed at the United States, but some of it was in Saudi Arabia itself. So I think there was a wake-up call for many of them. So you see all of these kind of things. Unfortunately, on the Palestinian side, the political and educational system is still stuck in the old thing. And they have not managed to kind of move and be in sync with the kind of energy and trajectory that we see happening, particularly in the Gulf.
Yeah. Drilling into these numbers a little bit, again, the headline I did of that column, which was in All Arab News on June 19th, was "No Regrets. 2 in 3 Palestinians support the October 7th invasion of Israel by Hamas." And I did that that headline to sort of try to get people to think about, at least at this stage, we're 9 months in, and what we're finding is, specifically in Gaza, 57% of Gazan Palestinians that were polled in the beginning of December, or I'm sorry, this was the same. This was in May, but it was the same as what the polling from December, so it hadn't changed. 57% of Gazan Palestinians support what happened on October 7th. Interestingly, in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, what, of course, Israelis would call Judea and Samaria from the biblical names, the number is 73% of Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority. So it's a 15-point difference, where one might think it was in reverse, that you'd expect more Gazans to be more angry and more at Israel and more supportive of what Hamas did than those on the West Bank at a cursory glance. But you, Ghaith Al Omari, being an expert on Palestinian politics and society, what do you make of the number being different? This is not a slight statistical difference. This is 15 points is significant between a lower percentage of Gazans who support October 7th than Palestinians in the West Bank.
Look, first of all, I'm not surprised at all. Just for perspective, this is not the first war between Hamas and Israel. While this is obviously more qualitatively and quantitatively different from anything we've seen in the past, but we've seen this pattern in the previous 4 wars that we have seen, where if you're in the West Bank, you look at this and it's almost kind of an abstract. This is something happening to someone else. Okay, to your own people, but your life is not being touched by it. I'm not suggesting that life in the West Bank is easy now, and actually things have been very rough, but they're not the ones who are being bombed. They're not the ones who have been displaced, etc. Right. What they do see actually is maybe some of the, let's say, quote unquote benefits. Suddenly the Palestinian issue center stage in the public international discourse. Add to it their very anger at their own leaderships makes them more willing to basically, the grass is always greener type of sentiment. Now, if you're in Gaza, all of the nonsense that the Hamas leaders are saying, this is a victory, blah, 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 when you see with your own life, I'm smiling, but it's nothing to smile about. Members of your family dying. Gaza, 80% of homes are no longer inhabitable, and on and on and on. You understand that this is just not a theoretical abstract issue. This is a real issue for you. And actually what we've seen in previous wars is that after every war, even this kind of support for Hamas, this rally around the flag sentiment, after the war, it plummets. So today, Hamas has 57%. If we're looking at the same kind of pattern that we see in previous war, expected to dip to the 20s. Again, this is what happened in the war in, say, 2009, in 2014, and a lot of those. In the West Bank, it goes lower, but it doesn't dip in the same level. So it's, again, it's sorry to kind of trivialize it, but it's a case of the grass is always greener, and a case of, as well, if your life is impacted by it, as it is in Gaza, that's the case. I would add also one small and a dynamic that's only now starting to kind of crystallize, which is in Gaza today, if you speak against the war, you're basically beaten up, if not killed, etc., by Hamas. Hamas is still using its thugs and using its, frankly, terror operatives, are preventing any alternative voice to come out from Gaza. What this does is when you have these anonymous polls, and I think the pollster we mentioned has enough credibility to know that it's anonymous, people actually express themselves. And we're seeing more and more cases of people criticizing Hamas, and many of them doing it at great risk to themselves.
Well, may their tribe increase, I say. But but without dwelling on it, I think it's even more interesting that you would see fewer Gazan Palestinians responding to a telephone poll of somebody they don't know calling them, and not, why isn't it I'm not really asking you, it's a more rhetorical question. Why isn't 97% of Gazans saying, yeah, October 7th, good, not being sure who's calling them? But anyway, I think that difference is something I want to keep an eye on. The difference between those who are living the results, it's not just the results, the implications, the ramifications, the devastation of an Israeli invasion as a result of October 7th. As you rightly pointed out, that there's a difference to what that feels like, and thinking, gosh, this was a mistake, compared to people in the West Bank who it's actually helping their political objectives in terms of isolating Israel and getting the world to turn against Israel, and obviously Israel being charged with genocide at the World Court and so forth. Let's turn to this issue again. Our main issue in this podcast is, what do Palestinians want, and do they see hope? And so if some of what they want is, October 7th was good, that's an important thing for those of us who are trying to understand the situation, for us to know. Again, Netanyahu may actually cite those polls. I don't know. But in his July 24th speech, he may very well say, look, with whom are you asking me to make a two-state solution with? People in the West Bank, 73% of whom support October 7th? That's 3 out of 4. Like that, how am I supposed to make peace with them? And, nearly 6 in 10? And we can say, it's a 15-point difference. But from Netanyahu's perspective, from almost any Israeli, even center left, is thinking, oh my gosh, if almost 60% of Palestinians in Gaza, after all of this, still think October 7th was a good idea, how would we ever make peace with them? And I think that's a fair point, especially when we go to this next point. And again, you can wrap up a couple of those ideas together, but the support for a two-state solution is really not what you might think by hearing President Biden lay out the case, or Secretary of State Tony Blinken, or almost any world leader at this point, including Arab leaders. You would think, this is like a 90% aspiration of the Palestinian people. But what we're finding is right now, according to Dr. Khalil Shikaki, director of the well-respected Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research based in Ramallah, the effective capital of the West Bank, only 32%, 1 in 3 Palestinians today support a two-state solution at this point. And according to Shikaki, this is a 13-point drop in the last poll from 3 months ago, which found 45% support. And so if you look at it from the other side, fully 65%, 2 in 3 Palestinians oppose a two-state solution. So what do you make of this, Ghaith Al Omari? You're an expert on Palestinian society, politics. With the world saying, American leaders saying, two-state solution, and Mr. Netanyahu, how come you're not for one? How come the question isn't being asked, are Palestinians actually for this? Because it looks like they're not.
Look, so much to unpack here.
Yeah, I know. I'll give you the space. That's the great thing of a long-form podcasting. You have some time to unpack that.
First of all, I am not surprised in the middle of war that people do not, let's say, embrace peace. Okay. And by the way, similarly in Israel, it was interesting to me today. I was looking at, on a tangent here, there's a new Israeli a merger of 2 Israeli left-wing parties, Meretz and Labor. They published their platform today. They're shying away from these issues. Why? Because they know that they're public in the middle of a war. doesn't want to do it. I was in Israel recently, and everyone that I spoke to, from the right to the left, from the security establishment to the diplomatic to the political establishment, no one has an appetite right now to talk about the Palestinian state, and the same is on the Israeli side. So that's kind of one point here. Another point is, I think if you look again over time, support for a two-state solution or not, often, I'm talking about the Palestinian side here, coincides of whether there is a credible hope for it happening. So during the 90s, when we had, a vibrant peace process, ultimately failed, but at that time was seen as credible, the support was very high. When it crashed, the support went down. People don't support what they think is unrealistic. So that's kind of another kind of angle to it. A third angle, I would guess, and I have not seen polls actually, but if I would look at polls in Jordan and Egypt of how many Jordanians or Egyptians support the peace treaty with Israel, I would say they're probably lower than what you have on the Palestinian side. Yet, in both cases, you have peace treaties that have been stable for decades. In the Egyptian case from the late 70s, the Jordanian case from the 1990s. Why? Because you have a strong government that's in control, and you have also a degree of legitimacy for these kind of governments. So I think all of these things, I don't see necessarily a link between the public support today and the possibility of a two-state solution. Why I think Biden, not only Biden, frankly, even Trump, in his peace plan, talked about the Palestinian state. So this is, I think, an almost unanimous.
That's true, though. Let's just note, to keep things in real time, former President Trump gave a recent interview in which he said he's rethinking his support for a two-state solution. So, but that's not definitive.
No, but I mean, I think there's a reason, because ultimately, look, I mean, I want to take a step back here. Why have we been talking about two-state solution? Not only because it's a nice thing, because for a fact, the Israelis are going nowhere, the Palestinians are going nowhere. At the end of the day, each wants to have a state of their own. Each wants to express their national identity, their religious identity, their way they relate to history, etc., through a state of their own. If you don't have that, you have a recipe for conflict. I think one thing, though, that October 7th, and I would even argue before October 7th, has taught us is maybe we should move away from this dreamy view of peace, where everyone holds hands and sing kumbaya, which is completely unrealistic. And after October 7th, I would argue, at least for a generation or two, not gonna happen. Let's go for a more realistic, a divorce-based arrangement, whereby heavy on security, heavy on separation. Israel obviously needs to ensure its security. Something similar, frankly, to what we have with the Israel-Jordan, Israel-Egypt, and less similar to what we have in the Abraham Accords. So let's look for a cold peace, because the alternative right now of a cold peace, I see it as is a constant conflict, and let's wait for public sentiment to change once the kind of traumas are down, and frankly, once the educational systems have been reconfigured to also not feed into the sense of anger and vindictiveness.
Okay, so again, sticking with the theme of what do Palestinians want, where do they want to go, and one can understand in this context maybe not being sure, and you're talking about sort of retreating in the fog to at least I want my team fighting. I don't want my team surrendering. I can't imagine peace with my neighbor right now. But that leads to a couple thoughts. 2 out of 3 Palestinians in this survey said that the Palestinian Authority should be dissolved. You've referenced several times, both in the previous podcast and now, an important point, which is most Palestinians believe that the Palestinian Authority, the system that got created by the Oslo Agreement, of which Mahmoud Abbas, or also known as Abu Mazen, is the Palestinian Authority president or chairman, they believe that he's corrupt and that the system is corrupt. In fact, 89% of Palestinians believe that Mahmoud Abbas should step down immediately because he's serving, I think, the 18th year of his 4-year term. And even though we can tease him about that, or tease is not the right word, but maybe mock. But the point is, we who are strong supporters of Israel don't really want Abbas to step down immediately or the Palestinian Authority to implode, because Hamas is actually more popular in the West Bank right now than they are in Gaza. So there's a lot there in terms of like, what is the future and why is all the pressure right now being on Israel? You need a plan, because what I see is, look, I'm sympathetic to the question, but if you start to look at the answer, a person like Netanyahu has no political motive internally, all politics being local, to say, well, let's come up with a two-state solution, because he's got a terrorist entity in Gaza that he's fighting tooth and nail, and he's got a corrupt, by the Palestinians' own definition of themselves, they believe the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. So who is he supposed to lay out the cosmic vision of how it's all going to work out nicely? I don't mind criticizing him when I need to, but I'm struggling to find out what should he want right now more than the Palestinians want. What do the Palestinians want? I'm trying to understand myself.
All right, look, again, so much to unpack here. And let me start with, that old dad joke. If you're being chased by a shark, you don't have to swim faster than the shark. You have to swim faster than the next guy. And this is exactly what Hamas has been doing. Yes, they are poor in governing. Yes, they have provided nothing. But when your competition is this corrupt, bad, inefficient, non-democratic, and the list goes on, entity, you'll do well. This is unfortunately human nature. Now, I mean, first of all, no one's talking about a two-state solution tomorrow or in the immediate future. I think what people want, and this is certainly what I hear when I speak to Arab officials, whether in Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf, elsewhere, they want to see a path towards a two-state solution, because they are worried, especially in this Israeli government, that there are those who basically are ideologically against any possibility of a future Palestinian state. And look, I think, to be fair, one criticism that I would lay on Netanyahu is the fact that since he's been prime minister, since 2009, was it? Or whenever he became prime minister then, he has actually led a policy that encouraged the separation, that continued to demonize the Palestinian Authority, maybe understandably in certain cases. But I think there is also a major problem with the whole international community. They have been comfortable with the status quo. I mean, basically, you said it. We don't want change in the West Bank because Hamas is so popular. And we forget that Hamas is popular because the opposition is so bad. And in my own view, if you want to talk about a two-state solution, you need to start by reforming the Palestinian Authority. Because unless the Palestinians have leaders that they can trust, leaders who will go to them and say, you know what, we know you don't like Israel, you know you don't want a two-state solution, we know you don't like X, Y, and Z articles in this peace treaty, but you need to trust us. And by the way, look, I mean, I grew up in Jordan. I remember very well when King Hussein of Jordan reached a deal with Israel. I was a young beginning of my career at that point. I remember sitting in my house in Jordan. King Hussein was not, he did not come and say, oh, look, I've been lying to you for the last 50 years. You have to love the Israelis. No. What he said, do you trust me? And we trusted him. And I think the Palestinians need a leadership that does that. Now, we know that the current Palestinian leadership is not going to reform itself. They've had plenty of opportunities to do that. They have not. We need a concerted effort by the international community. Israel has to be on board to do this. It is not so dreamy because it's been done before. George W. Bush, actually, President Bush, did a wonderful job at that, where it produced significant reforms among the Palestinians. I mean, this is a long-winded way to say that at the end of the day, if you want a two-state solution, which I still believe is the only way that we can end this conflict, then we have to, Israelis have to do their own part. And there's plenty to criticize them on. But the Palestinians have to do the issue of reform. Unfortunately, President Biden talked about a rejuvenated Palestinian Authority, yet it never left being just a talking point. And unless this kind of talking points are translated into policy, then Hamas or something like Hamas will always campaign on, look, at least we're not as corrupt as those guys. To leave you with
hold that thought for a moment. I have let this be out of balance. I didn't take the break. We need to take a quick break. We'll come right back and we'll come to a short ending with a very important question: who are the voices either inside the Palestinian world, in Gaza or the West Bank, or in the Palestinian diaspora, yourself included, who we might want to start watching, looking towards, like, who should give us hope if we want hope for the Palestinians? And I do, as an evangelical Christian, I do. But we do have to take a break or I'm going to get in big trouble. So we'll be back with the Inside the Epicenter podcast in just a moment. Just before we get back to our final part of our conversation in part 2 of this podcast, I do want to get to the verses of the day. And we're going to use the same ones as we did in the previous podcast from Proverbs chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, because I just think they speak so much to where evangelicals need to be thinking in our hearts. It's easy for evangelicals who love Israel to be angry at Hamas. I'm angry at Hamas, to be frustrated with the Palestinian Authority. True. But do we have compassion for the Palestinian people who were made by God in his image and have certain rights, civil rights, human rights? And the answer is, of course, yes, except that not every evangelical is thinking this way. And that's an important issue. So Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. And I think if you look at other translations, that's the New American Standard Bible translation, but open your mouth for those who cannot speak for themselves. And of course, there are, me as a pro-lifer, I would say that I open my mouth to speak for those unborn children who don't have the ability to speak for themselves and need to be defended and have inherent worth because God has created them. But I think that's also true not only of Israelis and Jews who feel under tremendous global pressure and abandonment, and that the world is turning against us while we defend ourselves from terror and radical Islamism, but it's also true of Palestinians. And I think it's important for, as an Israeli, as a Jew, and as an evangelical follower of Jesus Christ, for me to say Palestinians are about the most damaged brand in the world. They feel among the most loneliest people in the world. They are struggling to find their own human rights and civil rights, and they have not been well led, in my view. And so I think these scriptures are important. Therefore, just a couple prayer requests. Let's be praying that evangelicals ourselves would show compassion and find ways, practical ways, to bless Israel and her Palestinian neighbors at a difficult time. And pray for God to show mercy and bring healing, supernatural healing, to Israelis and Palestinians who have been traumatized and wounded, scarred deeply by this horrible war. And the Joshua Fund, this is a big part of what we do, not just the educational parts, explaining what's happening in the region and why it matters from a biblical worldview, like we're doing in this Inside the Epicenter podcast, but also real practical relief on the ground and strengthening local churches and local Christian communities to be a blessing to their Arab and Jewish neighbors as well. Welcome back to the Inside the Epicenter podcast. I'm Joel Rosenberg, your host. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now as part of a 2-month tour through the United States, speaking, doing media, board meetings, meeting with donors, talking to Israelis, Palestinians, lawmakers in Washington, and evangelical leaders around the country, briefing them on the latest pain and trauma that's going on between Israelis and Palestinians, between Israel and Lebanon right now. Lots to be discussing. And with me today is Ghaith Al Omari. He's a Palestinian expert at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's also on the All Arab News Advisory Board. So with that note, let's go into our final part of our conversation. Ghaith, a few years ago, I had the rare and surprised honor to sit next to, at dinner, one of the true Palestinian reformers, Salaam Fayyad. I happened to be at the American Colony Hotel having lunch with a Palestinian pastor at the time and his wife. And lo and behold, sitting next to us was Salaam Fayyad. Salaam Fayyad had been the finance minister, of course, for the Palestinian Authority and a real reformer in that role. As Chicago, I believe, a University of Chicago trained economist. And also then emerged as the Palestinian prime minister, serving under Mahmoud Abbas, or also known as Abu Mazen, and did a lot of reforms until, at least from my perspective and my reading of the situation, people like Mahmoud Abbas didn't like the reforms that were getting made and felt uncomfortable with how close it was getting to maybe decisions he'd made in his own life, and decided he didn't want Salaam Fayyad around. Now, my reporting indicates, Ghaith, that in late fall, a number of Arab countries, particularly the United Arab Emirates, began raising to the White House, hey, listen, the Palestinians need a new prime minister anyway. We all want reform. Let's start thinking how to get Salaam Fayyad into position. And my understanding is that Salaam Fayyad himself was interested. He's essentially in exile now. Nobody's asking him to do anything useful, but he cares very deeply about the future of his people and was open to serving in some reform capacity if he could have the authority that went with it. My reporting suggests that the Biden administration showed little interest in this, and this caused a lot of frustration among the Sunni Arabs in the Gulf that were promoting it and thinking, let's get ahead of this. We're not talking about change tomorrow in the PA, but if we're not starting now, when would we start? And then the thing was sort of dropped. First, what are you hearing? And can you tell us a little bit about Salaam Fayyad? Should we be looking at him, and who else should we be looking at to have hope for people who may be reform-minded within the Palestinian community?
Look, I mean, first, the one friendly amendment to what you said, I think he was the University of Texas, and this is how he connected with former President George W. Bush, both as Texas sports fans. But no, I mean, look, first of all, I mean, I don't want to get into this almost like, knight in shining armor kind of approach, because, Fayyad is someone that I truly respect. He's a friend. He's a mentor. Yet, what's fascinating about Fayyad is that he's not someone who parachuted from the moon. He was someone who was basically moving between the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and actually working in the Palestinian Authority. What made him actually rise to the top is that when a time when President Bush came and said, "We need Palestinian reform." He said it in a speech in the Rose Garden in the White House, and he was serious about it because, other presidents have said reform and they were not serious.
Well, Bush also said he wouldn't deal with Yasser Arafat anymore.
Bush was very clear. No leadership tainted with terror, no leadership tainted with corruption. Bush also managed to mobilize the Europeans and, most importantly, the Arabs to magnify the same message. And I remember as a PA official at that time, we understood we had no chance to reform, no option but to reform. And we had to start looking for reformers. And that's when someone like Fayyad emerged. What was interesting during his time is that, we talk about Fayyad because he was the prime minister. What was really interesting is like a second and third tier people who, you would not have given a second glance to when before that. Suddenly, when they saw the space, they emerged. What I'm trying to say is that there's plenty of talent if you give the talent the space. Now, this is kind of a general statement. To be more specific now, you're absolutely right. There was a time when there was a sense that the issue of Palestinian authority reform early in the war, in the kind of fall and into the winter, that's when we saw President Biden talk about a rejuvenated Palestinian authority. Look, part of that is the fact that people understood that the weakness of the PA is what led to Hamas's popularity. Part of it is the fact that Arab countries themselves, particularly in the Gulf, have done their own reforms and are no longer tolerant towards corruption and waste, etc. Now, when Abbas, the Palestinian president, started hearing that, he wanted to see if the US in particular was serious or bluffing. So what does he do? He appoints a guy who looks good on paper, yet who frankly is too weak to say no to him, and waited to see the reaction. The minute the White House said, "We welcome the appointment of Dr. Mohammed Mustafa," Abbas understood we are not serious. And I have to tell you, when I go, and I've been a few times this year to the Gulf, etc., and I speak to leaders there, they're very, very frustrated. They're saying, look, we're not willing to put a penny if Hamas is in charge, but at the same time, we're not willing to put a penny when, if it's going to go into someone's pocket. But they understand that without US leadership, because it's not only the Arabs who have to say this, the US has to lead, the Europeans have to be on board. So they're waiting for leadership coming from the United States. And absent that, I fear for the future. Again, it's not the lack of talent. There's plenty of talent. It's the lack of a space for this talent to grow, to emerge, to actually prove itself through good governance or through political participation.
Well, let me ask this last question then. I'm so enjoying, I'm enjoying this conversation, though it's happening in such a difficult time. But the reason I'm saying I'm enjoying it is simply because I'm really searching for, are there Palestinian voices that who am I? But that sound reasonable, that sound constructive. You're one of them, and so I hope there's a future for you in a future Palestinian government, and I hope there's a tribe that's may your tribe increase. I think even if I asked you to mention other names right now, they wouldn't resonate with anybody that are watching or listening. So I won't do that, but I'll close with this question. I guess it's the best way to ask it. What gives you hope? Do you have hope? And is there something, one or two or three things, briefly, as we wrap, that are giving you hope? Because I guess I would just say there is the possibility that a Gaza government will form. That's obviously not a Hamas government. It's not a PA government, potentially. So maybe the question is who, not literally who, but do you see hope that a group of visionaries or even technocrats that are moderate, reform-minded of Gazan Palestinians, or at least Palestinians from the diaspora, who are willing to come in and help lead a new Gaza? Are you hopeful?
I mean, look, one thing I've learned,
or is it too early?
No. It's not too early. I mean, one thing I learned in this career, you have no choice but to be hopeful. This is something that, you know it. You live in Israel. I know it. I lived among the Palestinians. At the end of the day, if we're not hopeful, if we at least don't try to always find an opening, something to do, then life will get worse for us. We might be the underdog. The chances of success might be minimal. But unless you try, then you know that the worst voices would come and fill that vacuum. So that's to me, giving up is not really an option if you are committed to the Palestinians or to the Israelis. Now, that said, it's not a purely kind of, let's say, passive thing, because I actually see two sources of hope. One is, frankly, when I talk to some of the younger Palestinians, and by the way, not only in the diaspora. Again, some people who were my staff, or some people who I've learned, I've met, who are in the PA, in civil society, who, if given the opportunity, will rise. Maybe 8 out of 10 will prove to be duds, but there is still talent there that I feel can actually rise given the space. The other thing that gives me hope, and it has nothing to do with the Palestinians, and we touched on it earlier, when I see how the region is changing, when I see, frankly, when I go to a place like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, never been to Bahrain, but hopefully that will change soon.
You should go. I'll go with you. It's beautiful. It's like if the Caribbean had money. It's a lovely place to be.
No, but look, I mean, frankly, when I deal with government there, it puts our government in this country, it puts European governments to shame when it comes to efficiency, effectiveness, responsiveness, etc. There is something changing in the Arab world. I would not have been so hopeful 15, 20 years ago, when, the narrative that we hear everywhere is a negative one. Today, but to give you an example, after October 7th, I've been repeatedly invited to speak on Arab satellite and different TV channels. Even though I'm very critical of Hamas, even though my voice has always been about let's reform, let's etc., because I think there's something new happening. This would not have been the case 10, 15 years ago. So I think a combination in my belief in the Palestinian people's ability and resilience, and on the other hand, the view that I see that there are actually homegrown models that the Palestinians can look up to and can emulate. Many Palestinians are actually living in the Gulf, have learned it firsthand. And it's not only by the way, the rich Gulf countries. Again, look at what's happening in Morocco, which is, by no means a rich country. So this is what gives me hope. What my wish is to see that our policy here in Washington aligns with this new reality. And frankly, for the Israeli government to see that there is also partners who you can work with to produce something different. And at the end of the day, to understand that a stable Palestinian polity is not only a Palestinian interest, but it's also an Israeli interest.
Well, Ghaith, I appreciate it very much. I'm glad that you remain a hopeful person. It may be because you don't actually live in the region, don't you? But no, it gives you a chance to talk to people that are a little bit freer to talk about things and have maybe a different perspective. But I think when I look at the Palestinian people, I will cite an assessment that my Lord and Savior, Messiah, Jesus, said of the Jewish people, that he had compassion on them. We read this in the Gospels, because they were sheep without a shepherd. And this, of course, was during a time of Roman occupation. Now Palestinians are struggling, and I don't see hope coming much from within the Palestinian society right now. I think with the educational system, with the media system, with the governance in both, either a terrorist regime or a corrupt regime, I don't see much coming from inside, though I think Palestinians who have had the freedom and the opportunity to spend time outside Gaza and the West Bank and see, as you're describing, what's happening in the Arab world that is transformative. I mean, it really, I don't think even evangelicals who are glad that the Abraham Accords have happened, but I'm not sure that our team basically fully has understood yet the breadth of the sea change of thinking and reform-mindedness that is happening in many, not all, Arab countries. And that, I think, means that there are a lot more visionaries and technocrats who are figuring out how to do it. And therefore, there's a lot of hope, and there's a growing team of Arabs who do care about the Palestinian people and have real life experience in the last 15, 20 years in making changes to their own countries. And I think want to help the Palestinians if the Palestinians are willing to be helped. It's going to need, I think, strong American leadership. And so this is another issue which we don't have time to get into now, is we're also in a moment of literal and figurative political and physical weakness right now in the Biden administration that's making it even more difficult for them to know how to help anybody else, because they're trying to figure out that they got a house on fire politically. But this is not a political podcast, but it is having an effect right now that we haven't even gotten into. But on that note, thank you so much for being on these two podcasts, Ghaith. Your insight and your compassion for your own people, as well as your kindness and understanding of the challenges that we as Israelis face is very, very important.
Thank you, Joel. Really, always a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for listening and watching to this episode of Inside the Epicenter. I'm Joel Rosenberg, the founder and chairman of the Joshua Fund. And we have a heart of compassion for both Israelis and Palestinians. And I hope that you will explore that biblically and practically as well. You can learn more about the Joshua Fund and what we do, why we do it, at joshuafund.com. Again, www.joshuafund.com. You can learn more about Ghaith Al Omari and what he does, what he thinks, with links in the show notes of this podcast. And please send us any questions, comments that you may have, suggestions for future shows. You can find a link to where to send those comments and questions and advice in our show notes as well. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and may God bless you as you continue to pray for and financially support the work that Joshua Fund does to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus. For all of our staff and board and team at Inside the Epicenter podcast, thank you so much. God bless you.
I'm Joel Rosenberg. On your left, you'll find some videos we've chosen specifically for you. We look forward to partnering with you to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus.